The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and good morning, and welcome to the webinar Shaping the Future by Advancing Open Source AI. We have 2 hours webinar where we have 2 invited speakers that are focusing on open source developments. And I will introduce the background for the webinars. The webinars cover topics such as designing efficient electronic circuits, integrating AI algorithms into devices, and leveraging tools for rapid prototyping and testing. The aim is to deliver an in-depth overview of EdgeAI platforms, tools, application, and industrial research and development in the field. In this webinar that we have today, the invited speakers present and discuss the technical challenges of creating an open source ecosystem that addresses the development of AI, generative AI, and EdgeAI technologies, frameworks, tools, and applications. The webinar agenda is as follows. I will have introduction, a presentation to give the background for the open source, and you notice that we put all the flavors of open source, hardware, software, and AI, and what are the challenges and the future trends. This is only to introduce the topic in order to give to our invited speakers the platform for presenting in details the notions related to open source concepts. Then we will have presentation. We had the switch in our presentation. We will have first Gael Blondel from Eclipse Foundation presenting open source AI, a key to Europe's leadership in EdgeAI technologies. And then we have the presentation on open source AI definition by Stefano Mafuli from Open Source Initiative. At the end, we reserve at least 30 minutes for a session of question and answers. We are planning to finish the seminar at 6 o'clock. You are welcome to ask the panelists and the speakers questions, and we are kindly asking you to put the questions into the chat of this webinar. So the today's presenters are Gael. I will start with Gael as he will have the next presentation. He is an open source advocate with 20 years of experience. He joined the Eclipse Foundation in 2013 and is now Chief Membership Officer, driving collaboration in the open source community. In 2024, he joined the board of the Open Source Initiative, the one that is run by Stefano. Previously, Gael co-founded an open source startup where he served as CTO and led open source business development for a system integrator. He's also spearheaded research initiatives to build an open source ecosystem for embedded systems. The Eclipse Foundation, his mission is to help organizations embrace fostering innovation through openness and collaboration. And you will see his presentation. He puts a lot of emphasis on his experience and the important elements that open source development brings to us, the designers and developers of AI systems. Stefano is the executive director of the Open Source Initiative. He is an experienced leader of open source organizations, from non-profit advocacy groups and trade organizations to business ventures and community projects across different countries. Proven track record in community building. He is also an active contributor to open source projects, and he was responsible for representing the idea and the definition of open source globally, with many challenges faced as a US-based non-profit company with a global impact. At the same time, he will focus on one of the hot topics that he will present, the definition of open source AI, a concept that was finalized last year, and he will share with us his experience during this process. So then if we are moving to the first presentation, my introduction on the topics of open source and some of the definitions that exist. I will first all start with two quotes from two well-known persons. One is Linus Torvalds, the one that started and developed the Linux operating system, and to Michelle Baker, which is one of the well-known CEO of Mozilla Foundation. So you see what is their opinion and how they see open source. And this is an important introduction to actually what the open source means for us. Open source is a paradigm and practice that promotes the free access, use, and modification of software, hardware, or other resources. It emphasizes collaboration, transparency, and community-driven development. You will see that these keywords will be used by our invited speakers across the presentation. Open source typically involves distributing the source code or design file, allowing users to study, modify, and improve the product. If we are going now deeper and address the definition of the different concepts, open source hardware refers to tangible artifacts such as machines, devices, or other physical things whose design has been released to the public so that anyone can make, modify, distribute, and use it. The hardware differs from software in the physical resources, and these resources must always be committed to creating physical objects. And therefore, individuals or companies producing items, products under an open source hardware license have an obligation to make it clear that such products are not manufactured, sold, or otherwise sanctioned by the original designer. And this is an important element for the open source hardware. The open source hardware definition is provided by the Open Source Hardware Association, and in the slide that I presented at the bottom, you have the link to Open Source Hardware Association. Some examples of open source hardware are RISC-V, Arduino, OpenMoko, Leon, Laser, Sour, that are examples of open source projects. If we are moving to open source software, then this definition is coming from different sources, and the open source initiative is keeping and updating the definition. And the open source software is related to computer software that is released under a license in which the copyright holder grants user the rights to use, study, change, and distribute the software and its software code to anyone and for any purposes. Open source software may be developed in collaborative public manner, and it's a prominent examples of open collaboration and has the ability to examine the code, facilitates public trust in the software. So this is an important element. Examples of open source software, we have, for example, the Android, the Blender, the OpenOffice, Perl and Python, Ubuntu, WordPress, and Drupal as open software projects. If we move to the new element that, as I mentioned, was defined last year, open source AI. Here we have the concept that open source AI is an AI system made available under terms and in a way that grant the freedom to use the system for any purpose and without having to ask for permission, study how the system works and inspect its components, modify the system for any purpose, including to change its output, share the system for others to use with or without modification for any purpose. And all these freedoms apply both to a fully functional system and to discrete elements of a system And the precondition to exercising this freedom is to have access to the preferred form to make modification to the system. What you will see, and this will be in the presentation that we have afterwards, the open source AI consider the AI system as an element or a system that combines hardware, software, the AI components, algorithms, and frameworks, and as well data. And this is an important element that is taken into account. Then I will very fast mention some of the benefits of the open source. We have cost effectiveness, customization and flexibility, faster innovation, transparency and security, community-driven collaboration, continuous evolution and availability of the software, avoiding vendor lock-in, and users are customers and stakeholders. This is a very interesting combination. Then we have some challenges in the development of open source, like security risk. Even we are saying that we can improve the security by developing mechanisms in a collaborative manner. Still, there are security risks and vulnerabilities as the development is done in an open environment. Then we have the complexity, the lack of funding. Many of these projects are funded by non-profit projects, intellectual property and licensing concerns, fragmentation and compatibility issues, maintenance and support challenges, steep learning curve, and governance issues. These are elements that we put as challenges, and our speakers afterwards will present more in detail what we mean by these challenges. Then we have open source EdgeAI technology stack. As we notice, we address the EdgeAI as a complex system that combines hardware, software, AI components, and the data. And these systems are built around a technology stack. And the open source can address the developments of different layers in this stack. And as we experience, and as many of the open source organizations experience, they are addressing the open source at different layers. So open source at the hardware level, open source at the AI frameworks, at the architecture levels, of the platform levels, of the data sets. So with this, I will conclude by presenting some of the elements related to future trends in open source. We have elements like decentralized AI and federated learning that will be used and addressed in open source activities. We have elements related to edge computing advancement that will be reflected in open source projects, and machine learning integration in open source software. So here the AI is part of the open source development. New funding models for open source initiatives and projects. Collaboration across industries, so more collaboration across industries. So we will not see further development of the silos, but collaboration across different industries to see the synergies between the different requirements in the different industries. Focus on security compliance to global standards and ethical issues. AI-driven automation in open source. So this is an interesting development. Increase adoption of open hardware. Demand for more data sovereignty, as this becomes an important element in the development of the complete EdgeAI and the AI systems. Open source AI enhancements, open source in education and how this will proliferate, and emphasize on sustainable open source development. And here, the sustainable doesn't mean only economically or only from the point of view of the business models, but as well from the point of view of the environment footprint. So with this, I conclude my presentation. I will just say that this webinar is sponsored by the EdgeAI project, which is a project that started in 2022, will end in 2026 in June, and has 48 partners from 10 countries with a budget of 35 million. Here you see the partners that are involved in the project, and with this I conclude my introduction presentation, and we will pass the floor to Gael. I will share just a moment the presentation from him.
Thank you, Ovidiu, for the invitation, and well, thanks everybody for joining. So, like Ovidiu said, I've been doing open source for a bit more than 20 years, and I'm part of the Eclipse Foundation for 10 years now. And I'm proud that I've been appointed as a board member of the Open Source Initiative last year. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation also with Stefano afterward about the open source AI definition. Just a few words about the Eclipse Foundation. So we are one of the general purpose open source foundations. We moved to Europe more than 5 years ago now, and we have this approach of being community driven. So we think that open source projects get their value from the community of developers and other people who collaborate on the open source project. We are code first, so we really value that an open source project should have code and should have code that delivers what the users are expecting. And we are commercial friendly because we think that, and yeah, that's I think on my last slide, but we think that not everything should be open source, but there should be a place for companies and the ecosystem at large to build business models on top of open source. So I invite you to visit our website on eclipse.org, and we frame ourselves as a community for open collaboration and innovation. For those of you who think that Eclipse Foundation is about the Eclipse IDE, so we have the Eclipse IDE, but we also have lots of other projects. A ton of other projects, more than 400 projects in IoT, in automotive, in cloud, and some of them in AI. I will show you some concrete examples later. We have a team, a global team of more than 80 people, and I like this number that the global investment in Eclipse represent more than $25 billion of shared technology investment. And that's a significant number when you think about it. Okay. Also, we have been for more than 10 years, we have been involved in research projects, and what we do specifically in research projects is helping them do proper publication of results in open source and try to create a community around their open source projects as soon as possible in the process. I'll come back to that later, but I invite you to visit eclipse.org/research. We also see a list of the projects we have been participating in recently. Just about open source, maybe some of you already heard me say that, but I'm very opinionated about it. It's really important to understand that open source is software that fits with the free software definition and with the open source software definition. And if you look at the open source software definition, ultimately that's a list of 10 criteria, but ultimately it goes back to the idea that everybody should be able to run a program for any purpose. So there's no limitation of the field of endeavor. Everybody should be able to study how the program works. So you should have access to source code. You should be able to redistribute copies, and you should be able to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. So you have to be able to modify the code and to redistribute it. So those four freedoms of the free software also apply to open source. And recently, of course, Stefano will go about it in further details. But last October, the Open Source Initiative published the Open Source AI definition. And it's really considering that an open source AI system, an AI system can be called open source AI when it provides everything you need to be able to implement the 4 freedoms for this system. So that means, of course, open weight, and to some extent, a lot of AI systems come with open weight. But beyond that, you should also have access to the source code to train the system, to the source code to train the data set, and you should have access to either the open data or all the information that were required to enable to create the data set. So that's kind of complex because AI is more than software. So with open source definition, it's just about the definition for open source software. But here we have to go a step further because an AI system is a lot more than just a piece of software. Another important aspect that I like to repeat is that open source is a way of managing intellectual property. So some of us with scientific or engineering background think that open source is more about, creating a community and building software with friends or fellow researchers, etc. But ultimately, since the beginning, open source is based on all the legal framework of intellectual property, and there's really a correlation between doing open source AI, and finding and building a business model around it. So we need to keep that in mind, and that's something that I want to repeat, because it's important that all of us with scientific and engineering background understand that when we do open source, yes, we collaborate, we do brilliant technical stuff, but we also implement a way of doing intellectual property management. And that's a way that is brilliant because the license is very short. It's 2 pages, and it makes things much easier than proprietary software or proprietary systems, because those licenses like Apache, MIT, or other, everybody understands them in the same way all over the world. So when you do open source, you really adopt an easy way of managing your intellectual property. And that's one of the main criteria to have a strong adoption and to spread the technology. Beyond that, there is different ways of doing open source. So you can just push your code on GitHub and create your own community around it, and you may be successful. You can also build a company and do what is called single vendor open source. I come back to that. Or you can bring your project and manage your project in the context of an open source foundation. Let's see a few details. Yeah, so that was the slide I was expecting. So if you push your code to GitHub, that's not necessarily a silver bullet, because there are more than 400 million repositories on GitHub, and the odds that your repository, your project will be noticed are very low. So pushing a code to GitHub is nice if you are an individual developer and you want to make some tries, etc. But if you want to have a strategy to promote a project and build on top of this project, etc., that's not enough. Then there is doing open source, single vendor open source. Single vendor open source is another interesting case, and it's not necessarily sustainable. Why? Well, because we have seen over the last few years that a lot of companies who are doing single vendor open source, at some point, they realize that, okay, maybe we could do more money if we do less open source. So, and usually what they do is that they ask all contributors to give them to sign a CLA, a contributor license agreement, that gives them all the rights on the contribution. The goal is that they can relicense the software under another license. So that happened with MongoDB, that happened with Redis, that happened with Elastic, that also happened with Terraform. And all of those projects, they were using open source to grow a community, but they really made sure that they could step back from being fully open source at some point. And there's no scale of being open source. There could be scale of openness, because to some extent some people may tell you that, okay, the SSPL is an open enough license, etc. But there is not a scale of being open source. Either you use a license that has been approved by the open source initiative, or you're not open source. That's how it is. And there is the idea that you can do open source with open source foundations. And the role of foundations is to enable sustainable, vendor neutral, and open collaboration. And why that? So if you think about the Eclipse Foundation, the Apache Foundation, Open Infrastructure Foundation, that's all nonprofit organizations which have deep into their bylaws the fact that their mission is to do exactly that, and that they will do whatever is possible to sustain open source projects. And so the fact that you have nonprofit organizations with a very specific mission makes it different and brings very interesting properties to what people can expect. So just to give you an example of what I mean when I say that it's deep in our bylaws. That's the mission statement, the latest version of the mission statement of the Eclipse Foundation. And what we see our mission statement as, those 3 bullet points. So we want to ensure user freedoms. So ensuring user freedoms, and here in users, that can be an individual or a company. But what we want to make sure is that when a user is picking an open source project from the Eclipse Foundation, they can be certain that the terms of the license will not change, because mechanically we cannot change the term of the license. Legally, we can only move from one version of Eclipse Public License to the next version of Eclipse Public License, or we, in all cases, we need to make sure that the project stays open source under similar terms. We want to empower developers to have fruitful collaborations, and to thrive as open source developers, to be able to demonstrate their skills and their talents. And we want to also enable collaboration between companies, between universities, and between individuals. And that's where we put all our energy in. That's where the idea of, on one of his slides, Ovidiu was mentioning governance. And we think that strong governance layer enables collaboration. So this is the kind of services we provide at the Eclipse Foundation. So you can see infrastructure for open collaboration. So our projects are hosted on GitHub, or they are hosted on our own GitLab instance hosted in Europe. Ecosystem development, so talking to new people about the projects we have. Governance processes, so it's really, if you want to know more about our governance, you can look for something called the Eclipse Developer Handbook. That's the reference manual for every developer doing stuff at Eclipse, and that's many pages long, but you have an answer to all your questions about how people collaborate at Eclipse. IP management and licensing, so we make sure that everything has compatible licenses. And supply chain security, because security is the next big deal for open source, like it's the next big deal for all software in general. And I think that more specifically in the context of edge computing, security is very important. And if you think about the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act coming into force very soon with all its requirements, then that's something that where the open source community has to make a specific effort. The goal is that all those services enable people and organizations to collaborate on technology platforms, and we want that those technology platforms enable the creation of products, all kinds of products, whether it's proprietary software, whether it's training, or other kind of services on top of the open source platform. And all of that rely on some rules of engagements, which are transparency, openness, vendor neutrality, and meritocracy. And I think vendor neutrality is kind of obvious, so we want to make sure that one member cannot block another member from participating, for example. Openness and meritocracy are described on my next 2 slides. And the idea with transparency and openness is really, well, I know that it's hard for every developer, but at some point, publishing your project in open source is really about opening the kitchen and making the mental switch to working in public. And that's not easy. It's easy for nobody, because at some point you will have the fear that people will judge your work, etc. The point is that people don't really judge your work because they have other things to do. But if you think you do open source but you don't switch to working in the open, that just doesn't work, because the people who could be interested in collaborating, in contributing to your software, if they don't see enough activity on the project, if they see that every 3 months, every 6 months, there is a new full version that has been cooked behind closed doors and that is made public, then they will lose interest in the project because they don't see how they can contribute, how they can participate. Next, another aspect is that meritocracy, and what we mean by meritocracy is that people who do are the ones who are right. So an Eclipse project, for example, or every open source project is usually managed by their developers. And the developers of the open source projects, because they bring new features, because they fix bugs, etc., they are the one who have the rights and the power to influence the project. So, of course, it starts with using a project, getting interested in this project, then starting contribution, and that can be code contribution or non-code contribution, like writing a blog or doing some triaging of bugs. And then you become a regular contributor, and then at some point you can be elected by the existing developers and co-opted as a new committer, and then become a leader of the project, etc. That's really important, and I think that talking about European leadership, I think that's something where we can do better in Europe, which is to trust our developers and to empower our developers to do more and to lead in open source projects. One small clarification is that there is some stuff that I would not qualify open source. Pushing your code to GitHub just for the review, that's what we call abandonware, and that's not cool. Not adding a proper open source license approved by the OSI to your project doesn't make it an open source. It means that you just publish your code, but it's not an open source project, because doing open source is voluntary. We talked earlier about open source as a way of managing intellectual property. That's because you are the authors or the owners of the code, that you can publish it in open source, and you need to do it by yourself. Source available licenses that put restrictions on the use of software, that's not open source. And even ethical source licenses are not open source. So you can think about ethics and it's important, etc., but that's not through open source licensing that you manage ethics. That's by code of conduct and what to do with the but not through the licensing by itself. So a few bricks to build EdgeAI. So that's some project that we already have at the Eclipse Foundation. So we have the Open Hardware Foundation that is doing RISC-V industry-ready, industry quality IP in open source. And that's licensed under Apache 2.0 or SolderPad license. And that's CPU cores written in System Verilog, and we do all the verification for those CPU cores. So we have several levels of CPU cores that start from the very small MCU to full-fledged 64-bit CPU. And that's because it's all available in open source. It's already used by people to be the control part of AI chips. So that's something that is developed collaboratively at Eclipse, and that is available for reuse by the industry and researchers. Another project that you may not know a lot about is Eclipse ThreadX. So that's an open source real-time operating system that is certified for safety critical applications. And it's already, you're likely already using it. For example, I have my iPhone, I have 2 occurrences of ThreadX. And that's really present in tons of devices. And the story of the project is that it was initially a proprietary project that was acquired by Microsoft in 2019. And then they started to publish the code, but not under an open source license. And in 2023, they open sourced it at the Eclipse Foundation. So we now have it, and we are building an open source community around it. You have several components for ThreadX. I will not enter the details, but you can see that some of the components have safety certifications with TÜV. And we have the details of the certifications here. So maybe some of you are aware, but we had a lot of open source edge related and IoT related open source project at the Eclipse Foundation. So Zeno, for example, is an important protocol. PAO, Cyclone DDS is a DDS implementation. PAO and Mosquito are about MQTT, and you have plenty of components here that I guess you have already used, and maybe some of you contribute to those components. And in our other collaborations, I think that the ones I want to mention regarding to EdgeAI are Eclipse Data Space, because that's really underlying technologies for data spaces, which in my opinion will play an important role in EdgeAI, because we need to manage all the data that will be produced and used by AI. Open regulatory compliance, where we manage, we address the challenges of Cyber Resilience Act and upcoming regulations for open source. And SDV, a software-defined vehicle, in which, of course, we will use EdgeAI technologies. And we also have AI projects already at the Eclipse Foundation. So maybe the most important one for today is Eclipse Edge. So that's a project driven by the CEA in France, and very active project that is a solution to build fast and accurate deep neural networks for, well, simulation, but also building those applications for embedded systems. So that works with Python and C++, and you generate really accurate and super fast applications that you can run in your embedded system. And in 2025, we are creating an AI interest group. So that's a new industry collaboration where we want to join forces with other organizations, and to also leverage those projects to create more traction in the domain. So a few additional thoughts about open source. One thing is that without an extensible architecture, it is hard to create an ecosystem. So if you think about it, everything that has been successful over the last few years, of last few decades, is something that has been built on extensible architectures. You can think about Kubernetes, you can think about Drupal, you can think about VS Code, Eclipse, etc. That's all. It's always the case that when you have an extensible architecture, it's much easier to create an ecosystem. About open source and digital sovereignty, it's super important, in my opinion, to not only leverage existing open source projects created in everywhere in the world. We need to make sure that we have the skills and the people to be able to study, to modify, and to adapt and to run those software. But we also need to make sure that we produce technologies and that we use open source to spread, to grow adoption of those technologies. About open source and competitiveness, because competitiveness becomes more and more important. So it's clear that open source creates faster and better innovation, and that it creates a level playing field where everybody can compete as equals. It's interesting that at the Eclipse Foundation, for example, we have members who are large multinational organizations, and they are seated at the same table to collaborate on the same projects with SMEs who are 50 people, and they really complement each other very well. And everybody in this ecosystem benefits from the fact that they collaborate in open source. Yeah, we were talking about interoperability. I think that's obvious, but I like to say that when you create an open standard, of course, an open standard is interesting, but if you have an open standard with an open source implementation, then interoperability is much easier and more guaranteed, because everybody can use the same software stack and extend that software stack. Just maybe a few things. I think that we can do better with open source in Europe. I'm a European, I'm French, I live in Toulouse, and I definitely think we can do better. And I want to take a concrete example. If you think about Kubernetes, for example, it is now a huge ecosystem with billions of dollars and billions of euros of business around Kubernetes. But at the beginning, it was created by a relatively small team of very talented people, but relatively small team. So it's not it's not $1 billion investment. It's more like $10 million investment or $20 million investment at the beginning. I get to the next slide. Yeah. So you have the team that was the core team of Kubernetes when they got a prize at OSCON in 2018. And what's interesting here is that you have the core developers of the project. And you also have Sarah Novotny, who was in charge of community building. So from the beginning, in a team of 5-6 people, they had one person full-time in charge of community building. And you also have on that picture, you have Chris Anichik, who is the CTO of the CNCF. And when they decided to go to create the first version of Kubernetes, they went to the Linux Foundation to create the open source ecosystem around it. And I think that this is a mix that is a recipe for success. Like, take a good product, do invest in community building, and invest in an open source governance with the collaboration of an open source foundation. And there will be something like a Kubernetes for EdgeAI. And that's what I say on my next slide. And there's no reason that we cannot do it and we cannot promote it in Europe. But we need to some extent to use the same recipes. And at some point, I mean, I'm involved in several projects. I know lots of people involved in several projects, and sometimes I have the impression that we need kind of to shift our minds from reinventing the wheel and working alone and restarting a lot of things at each new at the beginning of each new project next. So we need to change our mind from working on our own to organize as an open source community and collaborate to build the success and to leverage. There is one message here, is that we need to collaborate on creating research platforms in open source, properly operated in open source, and we need to leverage the platforms along successive projects and to also industrialize those platforms. So I think that if we do that, we have all the funding, we have all the smart people, and we have usually a good strategic vision, so we can do it. Next, I have two statements to conclude this presentation. The first one is on the next slide. It's from Astor Neumann-Karlberg from Open Forum Europe. We had a meeting with IPEAC in September, in which he told us that, you know, open source and permissive IP is in the interest of the challengers, and Europe needs to admit that we are challengers in ICT. And I think that what I like in this is that even if you look at the history, usually the leader in the market is not the one who is using open source, but that's usually a challenger in the market who is using open source. But we can create leadership in Europe if we decide to use open source more offensively and to use open source to really get adoption of the technologies we create in the project. And that's, I think that on the next slide, we have a lot of developers. One thing that is important is that we have a lot of developers who master open source in Europe. We likely don't have enough organizations that master open source in Europe. And I was in California last week, and I met someone from Berkeley who was the leader, or the creator of Jupyter Notebook. I had a short conversation with him about, well, it's impressive to see how many open source projects have been created and are still operated or led by Berkeley University. And if you think about the story I just told you about Kubernetes, Google launched Kubernetes, and I think that in both cases, you know, Jupyter Notebook was created by this guy who then found the job at the university and build a team to continue it, etc. Google with Kubernetes, they also bootstrapped it, but then they built a large ecosystem. We can get inspired by those stories, and we can likely have a much higher impact with our projects, in my opinion. And my one last thing is that not everything should be open source. But EdgeAI technology strategy without a compelling open source strategy is doomed to fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gael. This was an excellent presentation. A lot of messages. We will have a session of question of answers after the presentation from Stefano.
Hello, everyone. Meanwhile, I can introduce myself for the sake of time. I'm Stefano Maffulli. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Source Initiative, which is the organization that maintains the definition of open source, reviews licenses, reviews the legal documents that accompany software, and make sure that those licenses actually convey the qualities that are expected for the recipient of the software, that is the rights to use, study, modify, and share the software for any purpose without any discrimination on field of use or users. And that's one of the activities. The other activities that we do is to educate the public and the public, I mean corporations, nonprofit organizations, public administrations and academia in a variety of outreach efforts. We are California-based open organizations, charitable organizations, and we get funding from various sources. You can become an individual member and donate from $50 a year to and up to contribute to our operations. But we also get funds from some of the logos that you see in the slide from the nonprofit, other charitable philanthropic organizations like the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and also corporations from various parts of the world. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the genesis of the definition of open source for the field of AI or artificial intelligence, which the whole reason for us as an organization to jump into this field was a piece of news like this one on that was recently on the New York Times. It was a very touching story of a father who took a picture of his child and sent it to the doctor, and automatically in this case was a Google system, detected correctly that it was child nudity, but incorrectly flagged the account as child abuse. So clearly this was a case where an automatic machine was making a mistake, right? It was making the wrong decision, and not seeing the progress on the right. So it was making the wrong decision and creating havoc. So the question that immediately came to mind after reading this news was, okay, so there is a system that has a bug, and if you have a bug in a system as a technologist, the first thing that you want to do is to think about how to fix it, right? And fixing a system like this with a bug turned out it's non-trivial. It's not the kind of fix that you would expect from a simple or known software system, and I have a tremendous lag. I'm apologizing if I'm slowing down every now and then. It's because the software that we are used to deal with for many decades is written by humans, right? And we as open source people, free software people, proponents of the open source approach, we always use slogans like, if you given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, meaning that if you share your source code, if you share the instructions on how to build your system from scratch, then more people will be able to intervene, fix issues, add functionalities. And instead, the problem was that we realized that for the AI systems that make automatic decisions, the concept of source code was not really the same that we were getting used to. And that required us to do a little bit of an investigation to understand how to untangle and clarify what was happening in the systems that are basically black boxes. They seem to be not behaving as expected. So we needed to take a step back, and it was a pretty humbling and complicated step back that we needed to take. And we needed to do it very quick. We needed to act very quickly, because this fact that these AI systems are being deployed at a very rapid pace, to the point where regulators, especially in Europe, are concerned about them and regulating already in the market. And we noticed that while the European Commission was 3 years ago was starting to draft the AI Act, they were also trying to avoid. They were also being aware of the fact that open source requires some special treatment. So we wanted to be ready to tell them what open source for AI meant, so that the regulation would not constitute an impediment to the development of open source AI. At the same time, we were also seeing a lot of abuse coming from actors, commercial actors especially, who wanted to use the label of open source, and they were willy-nilly applying to anything that they, according to their own opinion. And these were not really in line with the principles that we have been defending when it comes to the term open source. And also, we realized that because there is no source in the context of machine learning and AI machines, we realized that we did not have an answer to explaining the open source definition itself, which on its point number 2 says that the source code must be made available to recipient of the software, of the program, in the form that will be preferred by a programmer to modify the program itself. So again, in this context, we didn't know what the meaning of the open source definition point number 2 was, and we needed to find out. So very quickly in the process of finding out what open source meant, we realized that the principles of free software, the very basic idea that you as a recipient of a system, you need to be able to use, study, modify, and share it for any purpose and without having to ask for permissions. Those are fundamental freedoms that we as a community and as a community had really no problem with identifying these pieces, but we stopped at the complement to those 4 verbs, to those 4 sentences that even in the free software definition, which is another way of presenting open source, there is, next to the words of modify and study, there is an extension, another sentence that says you need to have access to the source code as a precondition for these. So we went back to square one. What is that form that is preferred by an expert to modify the behavior of an AI system? So in order to find the answer, we knew that we didn't have the luxury of possibly coming up with a definition that would be immediately understood, immediately agreed upon, if we stayed in a room, like a couple of experts in one room and came out with sacred text at the end, which is more or less what happened in the very early days of the late 80s when the free software definition was written. It was basically the work of a single genius working in a university department. We didn't have that luxury because AI is being made available and is being developed with millions of people already using it. So we needed to have a much larger participatory process. And we as Open Source Initiative, organized with this co-design process, which was largely funded by the efforts of the Alfred Sloan Foundation, to put together more than 100 volunteers, experts in different fields from 20 plus countries in all the continents except, unfortunately, Australia, Oceania, and put them together to design together to understand the answer to that question: what is the preferred form for an expert to modify an AI system? And we went through phases. We defined first what it was that we needed to focus on, which is the AI system. Then we analyzed 4 popular systems to understand, asking about 25 volunteers in this phase to tell us, these were all developers of AI, builders of AI systems, to tell us what elements they wanted to have access to in order to use, study, modify, and share them. Then we took those results and drafted the first definition. We used that definition draft to validate with 13 different AI systems and ask another set of volunteers to review these 13 systems, find the components, find the conditions for availability of those components, and validate that the definition worked. In other words, that the systems that we're releasing all of the information to replicate and formally rebuild the pipeline that built the system were actually a valid open source AI according to the draft. And after that phase, which proved that the system, the definition was working well enough, we iterated a little bit to the text, refining it and making it more clear. And at the end of October 2024, we released a stable version 1.0. Yeah, that is the process that I just talked about. But so the most important thing that came out of the process, the summary, is this definition of open source AI, which basically is an AI that gives you the 4 freedoms to use, study, modify, and share. And that means that you need to release and make available the model weights parameters, the complete source code used to train the system, the complete source code used to create the original training dataset, and the actual training dataset with an asterisk, with a footnote that says when it's legally possible to do that. And all of these components need to be made available under terms and licenses that are compatible with the original open source definition. So crucially, the question that one needs to ask when you see a model or a system that has been released, you need to ask yourself, do I have all the tools, all the knowledge without any restrictions that has been made available so that I can build that system from scratch? And of course, with a caveat, thinking about the fact that replicability of these systems is still mathematically not a certainty, or it's still highly debated whether that's even possible. But the idea is to build something, to have all the tools and all the elements with all the freedoms, so without any restrictions, to build something that at the very least looks and behaves the same way as the original one. And so now the problem is that we have actors on the market right now that are doing things that are not really good. Like, they're calling open source their systems, and they're hiding behind these acceptable use policies. To appease the European regulators, they want you to accept that openness is a scale, that some restrictions on the use is of these AIs are acceptable or even inevitable, because AI is different, because AI is too powerful, it's too dangerous. So we need their argument, and I'm talking especially about companies like Meta. They're arguing that these acceptable use policies are required and necessary, but still their systems should be allowed to be called themselves open source. And that, unfortunately, we believe it's a trap. It's something that we cannot accept. The principles of open source are the same, even though we're talking about AI systems. And the thing is that we're not really against, the OSI is not against the concept of acceptable use policies. We just don't want them to be, they need to be applied to the deployments of AI. Placing subjective terms into licenses that don't do anything but choke adoption and innovation. So the risk is that European regulators may want to turn developers and builders of AI into the police. But we, just like we have argued in other venues and in other topics outside of the AI systems, that the regulation should be at the deployment level, not put on the shoulders of the developers. And also, we don't want to be in a place where we can accept that openness is a scale, that some restrictions can be accepted, because some restrictions are are bad. Some restrictions force you to enter into negotiations all the time, which is exactly what happens when you have proprietary software. And these being behind these bars of having to all the time ask for permissions. Can I use your system? I only have 100,000 active monthly users. Can I use it? Or what if I got 105 monthly users, but only for a month? Do I still need to negotiate a license with your sales team? That's not good. So we want to clarify that the open source, being open source, is not a degree of open. It's an explosion of freedom after you pass the bar of granting those freedom. Like after having deployed and used, complied with the definition of open source and open source AI, after that you have freedom. Before that you have only degrees of deprivation and suffering. So to give just to conclude, we did have the open source AI definition has been tested and validated, although in a small scale. The slide moves on. Okay, for example, on the right hand side, you see the list of systems that have been reviewed and validated. And for example, all the work done by LLM 360, Luther AI, and the Allen Institute for AI is compliant, seems to be very compliant with the definition. Also, other systems like StarCoder, Bloom, and Falcon, they would comply if they change their licensing agreements, because they insert acceptable use policies that are not that different from Meta policies. So they have restrictions, but definitely most of the commercial systems that we have analyzed from Meta, from Mistral and IBM, they don't comply with the definition one way or another. Whether they, like Llama or Mistral, very opaque. They don't share the details about how the training has been done and what the data sources are. Granite share the data sources a little bit more details, but still doesn't share the training code or the code used to create the data set. And so we have also received some criticisms from the community, like the best one, the one that I prefer, is that it's the wrong term. Open source AI is the wrong term, which is absolutely, I agree with. There is no source inside an AI machine learning. So definitely open source is the wrong term. But at the same time, unfortunately, it's also the term that, for example, Meta is using in TV advertising to describe Llama. So it's not a term that can be left defined by commercial actors or other individuals who don't have the mission to defend the meaning of the term open source. So we had to jump into the conversation we didn't want to have. Other criticisms around the process, of course, could have been different, could have been done better, could have been slower, could have been faster. And the other criticism that many have expressed is that it's the criticism on the footnote that I mentioned when I talked about the definition. The fact that the data must be released, the footnote says, unless it's legally impossible. And some groups like the Free Software Foundation and the Software Freedom Conservancy have criticized us for not putting a clear mandate for open data. And we haven't done that because the open data is a very tiny subset of the available data and the possible data. And as you may know, these systems are hungry for data, and the more you have, the better the system seems to be behaving, at least as of today with the technology that we have today. And so we wanted to have the possibility to include inside the definition all sorts of different AIs and machine learning, including the ones that don't create data sets, don't rely on open data like medical data, for example, or other private data that cannot be shared. And we didn't want to give an unfair advantage to proprietary systems that have access to data that they don't have to share. So like clearly also the Software Foundation, for example, is very interesting because they haven't solved the moral dilemma in any case, and they don't feel the time pressure that we have felt. So we released this definition thinking that it's the best possible outcome as of today, doesn't compromise at all on our principles. On the other hand, though, the other criticism that we have received is from corporations saying that it is too restrictive. In other words, that the requirement for training code and data processing code is not really required because, for example, Llama, which is quite opaque, like I said, has been modified its behavior, has added functionalities, etc., without having access to the training code or the data processing code. So this is something that we take also seriously, just like any other criticism that we have received. And we're working, in fact, on evaluating how to improve the definition and make it fit more to the practice that is happening in the field. By practitioners. So what you can do today is to endorse the open source AI definition if you believe that this is the best outcome, and help us correct Llama and Meta because it's not open source. It doesn't even have to get into the discussion of whether it's an AI or not an AI, an open source AI or not an open or not. It's just not compatible. The terms of distribution and use of Llama are not compatible with the basic principles of open source. So it's very easy to say, whatever, it's not an open source tool. So with that, I leave space to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. Thanks, Gael. So now the floor is open for questions to the participants, and you can put your questions using the question tab, and we will receive the question, and then we will ask our invited speakers to address your question. So in your panel, you have button that has a question mark. It's the question tab, and then there you can place your questions. I'm thinking of the evolution of the definition. You mentioned that you are planning to have a revision and you are planning to improve the definition. What is the process and how people and the organization can participate in this process?
Right. So we are in this first half of the year, we're going to be continuing our consultations with our partners. That includes all the people who have participated to the drafting process and the ones who felt they've been excluded. That is the groups like the Linux Foundation who have participated but not engaged as much as required or just as much as hoped for. The groups like IBM, Meta will keep continuing talking to them to see, record that feedback. We're going to have consultations in the second half of the year more publicly on our forums in an effort by the end of the beginning of Q4 in 2025 to have a proposal for the board for a process to run in 2026. So this year is mostly listening and watching what's happening. Because one of the things that I haven't mentioned on the deck is that there are at least two groups that we have found out have been referring to the open source AI definition to evaluate the suitability of systems for their own uses. One is REN, from the French government, is the Center for Digital Innovation or something like that. They have a website where they show a variety of generative AI systems and image creation systems, LLM and vision LLMs, with filters, so you can go there and inform yourself which ones are open source or compatible with open source, and which one are not granting the freedoms or the components that you require so you can make an informed decision. And another group is this startup called UMI, OUMI. They also have a very similar, they have an inference engine from, if I remember correctly, or something like that, and they offer a lot of models, and they have a way for you to go and filter the ones that are actually open source, according to the definition of open source. So the system is being used and deployed already in, we're watching how how people are using it, the definition of open source, and see where it may have some critical aspects emerge.
Thank you very much. Then another question related to DeepSeek. So there is a lot of discussion around DeepSeek. How you define the development?
Yeah.
This real open source, and what about the concerns related to security and the vulnerability that we hear in the media, and there are different stories around this development.
Let me clarify. I mean, when we talk about these LLMs, a lot of the times we, in the press and in the public perception, we think of the chat interaction or the applications that we download on the phone. So when we're talking about DeepSeek, we need to make it clear what we're talking about. The company DeepSeek has a chat bot that you can install on your phone, or you can go on the website and you can interact with. But they've also released an array or like a few models that you can actually download and run locally on your own. Whether you have the hardware capabilities of doing that, that's a different story, but you can, right? And of these models that you can download, there are a variety of them under different use and terms and conditions. So the one that is open source is released with a license that is compatible with the open source definition. There are two, DeepSeek v3 and DeepSeek R1. These two R1 is the one that has been released at the beginning of this year and has the reasoning capabilities that got everybody excited. That model has been released with a very detailed paper that describes how it's been built and how it's been trained, and how to run inference on it, and with some code also on the inference front. So it's not compatible right now with the definition of open source AI version 1.0 because it does not share the complete source code used for building the dataset and running the training. That said, they have released other things that are being used by Hugging Face to replicate something that looks and behaves like DeepSeek using different data and different training code. So we're waiting for that. This is one of the things that we're watching this year. What's happening actually in the field? The practitioners, how are they using these technical reports, these papers, research papers? How are they building communities around collaboration and innovation around what's being released by the original developers, and that's going to be informing our 2026, our plan for revision of the definition 1.0. I gave you a convoluted answer and probably not really satisfactory, but you can take this one. The short version is, according to version 1.0 of the open source AI definition, the DeepSeek R1 is not an open source AI model or an open source AI system, but at the same time, it's a lot more permissive and a lot more available. The parameters are available with a very permissive licensing.
Thank you very much. Then we have a question for Gael. You have mentioned open source hardware and AI for software-defined vehicle as part of the open source initiative. Are you coordinating this with the ISO regulators? For example, FUSA, SciSec, or it can be some open source variant of regulations too. So I think the question goes for both of you. So maybe we'll start with Gael and then Stefano.
Okay, so I don't know enough of the details, so I could connect you to my colleagues working on Eclipse SDV. My point was more that in Eclipse software-defined vehicle, I think that it's obvious that at some point we have some edge AI projects, but I would need to look for the details about what edge AI, if we already have such edge AI projects. One element about ISO and standards is that if there are standards that are relevant and we can implement them in open source, so the IPR of the standard enables open source implementation, then we are happy to have open source implementations. On the other hand, we are also GTC1 pass submitter. So we have, not in automotive, but in other topics like IoT and now in data space, we have used this pass submission fast track to push some standards that have been designed as open specifications at the Eclipse Foundation and have then been pushed to become ISO IEC standards. So that's, if you want to know something more specific, drop me an email and I will connect you to my colleagues.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add some comments, Stefano?
In general, I can talk about the compatibility of open source software and standards. They go fairly well together until there are standard essential patents in the standard. So it's a very complex topic that may deserve an expert or some deeper dive.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. Let's see. So our asker is happy with the answer. So let's see on some of the opportunities that you see for the open source AI. So and how this can be applied to edge AI, because you have a kind of different flavor when you develop the large AI system in the cloud and systems AI system at the edge. What is your position and where you see the opportunities in these developments of open source edge AI projects?
I mean, I've been spending a little bit of time with Firefox team and chatting with them. And for example, they have some of the constraints of the edge space also are reflected into mobile browsers. So you need to be available for small bandwidth, and you cannot download large models. The inference need to be running on smaller chips that require less energy, etc. And I've seen, I mean, they're doing some very amazing things with a limited amount of power and energy requirements. I see a lot of opportunities in there from various ways. The collaboration happening on the data curation and creation of new, they're being referred. I mean, we're talking about these as data commons rather than repositories of open data. Simply think about, there is a very large data set called Lion from images. This is one of these. Common corpus is another large data set of text that has been curated. It's a European effort curated to create large data sets that are widely available, that are safe to use, that have they're curated for quality, but also for bias, etc. There's a lot of collaboration also happening on the inference. Like think of the little inference engine called Olama that Mozilla is one of the sponsors. That it was created when the first version of Llama leaked accidentally, and developers wanted to make it run on CPUs instead of GPUs. So there is a lot of innovation happening in this field, and it's moving very quickly, and it's amazing to watch. We'll have to see how it evolves.
Thank you very much. So maybe a question again for Gael. Do you have any cases of open source for personal well-being, so related to AI and AGI, I guess, specific projects?
Not at Eclipse for the moment, but that's an interesting question. So when we talk about open source AI, I think that there is the open source AI definition that Stefano presented, but we also need to figure out, a lot of components will still be open source software. And for those open source software components, then the open source definition just applies. Like if you think about scikit-learn, for example, that's a good example of open source project that can be used in many use cases. I was talking about Eclipse Edge, that AI DG that is led by the CEA, and that's also an interesting platform that you can use. That's pure software that you can use to build your AI system. And then the question of do you host large data models or something, large language models or something like that. It's not something we have solved internally, for example, for the moment at the Eclipse Foundation. And so when you talk about healthcare, maybe Stefano can answer, because healthcare is one of the topics why we use data information in the open source AI definition and not open data, because we know that when you have systems that AI systems in healthcare, we know that of course you cannot you need to train them locally and do some kind of federated learning or something like that. We don't have such systems hosted at the Eclipse Foundation for the moment, but we would love to.
Stefano, please.
No, I can elaborate a little bit about the need for allowing for private data to be used for training an open source AI. It was exactly what Gael was saying. The case of universities or research institutions or hospitals that want to train on patients' data, and they have under strict regulation, they cannot really pool their data sources, their data, without having, well, they cannot do it. Or there are systems that are like federated learning. There are techniques that don't end up producing a shareable data set. So in those cases, we wanted to cover and allow for an open source AI to be possible.
Thank you. Another question, very interesting, related to auto generation of code. When the machines are generating code and will be participant in open source initiative or project, how this will be treated, or how you see the evolution and how you see the challenges?
Yeah, no, this is actually a very hot topic. It's debated almost weekly in legal circles that I'm part of, and it's not a solved issue. The recommendation is to track at the commit level. Right now, the latest that I've read that resonates and makes sense to me is that you're better track at the commit level all of the contributions that have been supported or aided or by a copilot or one of these code generation activities. The same way that you would instruct your development team to document, to keep track of any snippet that was copied from the internet at every commit or in comments inside the source code itself. The same level of granularity and control needs to be added to the for code generation.
And at Eclipse, we are working on our policies on that. But yeah, I'm on the same mailing list, and I also think that this proposal is definitely interesting to track at commit level.
Thank you. Then another question related to multimodality in AI and AGI systems, and how you will manage this diversity of data sets that are coming from the different sources.
So we have released a white paper quite detailed white paper to talk about data and data governance. The scale of these data sets, even just for language, is so mind-blowing to me. When I realized that the largest publicly available data sets used for training models of 15 tokens, 15 billion tokens, require petabytes of text compressed, and the whole of Wikipedia is only a few gigabytes of XML uncompressed. So it's a scale that is mind-blowing, and it requires really an evolution of our tooling when it comes to data management, tooling standards, compliance management. All of these things still need to be developed. Like, think about all the standards to safely exchange data. Like, there is data is sold, for example, between corporations. Like, every time you use a credit card at a convenience store, that what you bought and when you bought it, etc., gets sent to Visa or MasterCard, and that data gets sold to other to data processing organizations and corporations. So just tracing and tracking all of that for privacy reasons, for other compliance reasons, the standards are very, very primitive right now, and that needs to evolve. The whole concept of data governance needs to evolve, is evolving, and needs to evolve.
Thank you very much. Any thoughts, Gael, on this question? Okay, but then another question related to explainability and the interpretability, how this could be embedded in the open source and the open source AI.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, Gael, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just about to say that I think that explainability has nothing specific to do, from my understanding, with the fact that it's open source or not. It's really more a feature. But of course, open source brings, because you can you have access to all the model and also to the data information, etc. And you have more information to be able to do explainable AI. But I had in mind, and maybe I'm wrong, but I had in mind that explainable AI was a field of AI that is requires specific research beyond just the access to the source code or the model.
Right, that is definitely something true. The research is still primitive. Like, many things in this field are at the very early stages of understanding from the human knowledge capacity. But at the same time, it was one of the inspiring principle of developing the open source AI definition, was to make sure that whatever was the result, it would not be an impediment to an explainable AI, to a safe AI, to a responsible AI. In other words, what we ended up with is something that, if it's not a direct consequence of it, if it's not a direct cause of explainability, it is an helping factor to explain. The more transparency, like Gael was saying, which is also the argument for safety and risk management, the more transparency you have in the way you built it, the way you created it and treated the source data, the training data, how you created a data set and filtered, how you built guardrails into the model, into the applications themselves. Having the source code and having full documentation cannot be anything but a positive factor.
Okay, thank you. And now one last question that we have for both of you. As we see that more and more trends in the development of AI is around composable models and agentic workflows, how you see the development when these models and agentic workflows are a combination of open source and proprietary solutions? How the system that will be built will be defined.
On the agentic aspects, one of the projects I was mentioning during my presentation, that's Eclipse Elmos for language model operating system. And that's definitely a platform that instead of managing applications is designed to manage AI agents. So I think that having this kind of platforms available in open source and making sure we collaborate to make it more powerful, etc., is definitely something exciting.
Right, and I can't, like, for example, the word agents, the concept of agents wasn't really front and center even 6 months ago when we were drafting the open source AI definition. So frankly, I don't have an answer right now. But I have a recommendation for anyone who encounters something new, just like we did with the open source AI definition. If you see an agent, the one question that you always have to ask yourself is, do I have the tools? Do I have the documentation, call it the knowledge? And do I have all the rights for me to take what I have received and fork it, meaning build something else out of it?
Yes, indeed. So we thank you very much for your presentations and your contribution. I think we had a wonderful 2 hours webinar touching on some of the topics that are hot. And I hope that our listeners enjoyed, as I enjoyed myself, this session. Thank you very much. And I hope that we will have you again, probably in another event, maybe a conference or another event organized by this community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.